All right, let's welcome back in Mike McIntyre from the Winnipeg Free Press, taking a break from pulling the Ken Wiebe and essentially just becoming a pro golfer for the summer. Mike, how's the swing? I hear you sank an eagle putt at one of these tourneys you were there this week. I mean, that must have been a highlight.
It was. I'd like to say that I actually contributed to the first two shots leading up to the eagle putt, but I did not. This was the best ball tournament, and my ball was far from best. But I did sink the eagle putt. We actually went on quite a run yesterday, Huss. This was the IBAM Dale Rempel tournament out at Pine Ridge and Elmhurst. We weren't very good the first 12 holes. We were 4 over par, which for those that have played in a best ball, that's not great. But we went on an absolute heater to end the round, 6 under on our last 6 holes, 4 birdies, an eagle, and 1 par. So we finished the tournament in the red at 2 under, and I got to sink the eagle putt. They have all these little contests, right? Like in between holes and stuff. So I actually found that I'm a lot better at other things on a golf course. I hit a jumbo marshmallow off a tee really well. And I was able to nearly chip into a toilet as part of another contest. And actually, the best putt I sunk all week was back on Tuesday at another charity event we were in. This is the Blake Wheeler tournament, actually out at Bridges. I sunk a 15-footer using a composite hockey stick. And so maybe I should make an adjustment on the greens because I seem to putt better with a stick as opposed to an actual putter.
Yeah, I can't wait to see you rolling around, pulling out a Sherwood on the 8th hole at Kingswood in your next round or over at Kildonan and go, what's that guy doing? Well, he picked up the technique at the IBAM Dale Rempel tournament, and he's never gone back after that. Mike, let's, first off, it's great to have you back on the program, and it's been sort of a slow time for Jets news over the last couple of weeks. It's been a great time to spend some time on the golf course because we know how exciting and busy things are going to get as we get into the week. And I'm sure most people have read your piece with Josh Morrisey on the passing of his father. If people haven't, they certainly should do that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that with you first off, because, Josh Morrisey, and this is what pro sports is about. All we do is see what's happening with the player on the ice. And, God knows we've got a lot of conversations about who Josh Morrisey's playing with and, what's his level of game at, what does he need to do to be better? Many of us, had the same conversation after Nate Schmidt and Brendan Dillon were acquired that it should be a big boost for Josh Morrisey. But man, after reading your piece in the Winnipeg Free Press, it was quite clear that Josh and his father are incredibly close, and this was an ordeal that couldn't help but absolutely affect so many aspects of Josh's life, when it comes to just where your headspace is day to day, even going back to, out of the bubble with off-season training and getting ready for the upcoming season in a very, shall we say, strange way that you normally would be used to.
Yeah, it was a terrible news to learn back on August the 8th, a few weeks ago, that Tom Morrisey, quite shockingly, had lost his fight against brain cancer. Huss, this was less than a year after he was diagnosed. Last September was when the terrible news came, actually shortly after the Jets got knocked out of the Edmonton bubble. And it obviously threw the Morriseys for a real loop. I'll say this. I mean, Josh Morrisey, for a very public athlete, this was a private battle that he and his family were obviously involved with. And I give Josh Morrisey all the credit in the world for, opening up to me last week about what his family and what he and his father had gone through. I actually first met Tom Morrisey a couple of years ago. I was working on a feature at the time. This is shortly after Josh signed his long-term extension with the Jets. And I wanted to do a bigger piece on just, who Josh Morrisey was. And I had the privilege of meeting Tom actually at what was then Bell MTS Place. He was in town. As I learned, he was often in town. He would often fly in from Calgary to watch Josh up close. And in fact, he would go on a lot of road trips as well. Tom had been heavily involved in Josh's life, not unlike many hockey parents, whether your kid makes the NHL or not. I mean, I have 2 kids who played hockey, and I coached them for close to 10 years. Tom Morrisey coached his son, Josh, for a number of years as well. And in fact, even in off seasons, would still work with Josh on the ice. Tom ran a bunch of hockey schools and clinics in the Calgary area, beloved in the hockey community out there. So, as you can imagine, news of his illness and then his death was a real shock. But you're right, Huss. I mean, the apple didn't fall far from the tree here. We all know, I think, the person Josh Morrisey is, very humble, honest, a guy that's really easy to kind of root for, right? And Dad is very much the same. And I could see where Josh got his qualities from after meeting Tom Morrisey. I actually stayed in touch with Tom over the last couple of years. And we'd often talk not so much about the Jets or Josh. We just talk about being a hockey parent and, just what that life was like. And I was quite flattered actually to hear Josh later shared with me that the article I'd written at the time about him and his dad and their bond, that he actually framed it and it was in his house just kind of as a reminder. And that just told me how treasured Tom was to Josh and this bond they had. But yeah, this past season, as we know, players were playing in the middle of a pandemic. There were no fans. That meant no family at games either, right? And so for Josh Morrisey, who would become so accustomed to seeing his dad, to meeting him, after a game to kind of dissect everything that went on, even though the Jets were playing a bunch of times in Calgary, where it would have just been a beautiful setup for Tom to come and watch him, obviously he couldn't. And even worse, I mean, Josh couldn't even really go see his dad, right? Because of all the protocols players had to be under. And so his dad was fighting this battle, and Josh would still talk to him on the phone after games. He told me that was, part of what was helping his dad through this fight, just to have the Jets and hockey as a distraction here. But yeah, I mean, one of the stories that really stuck out, Huss, you touched on it, was the offseason last year before the Jets returned, for training camp just after Christmas. Josh said that he was quite concerned. His dad was going through chemo and radiation. And obviously he was worried about maybe bringing COVID, into that situation. So rather than go skate like he normally would with a large group of other NHL guys in the Calgary area, go train at a gym that he regularly went to, he had to really lock himself down. And he was literally skating in a barn just outside of Calgary that a buddy of his owned, and installed a really small sheet of ice. He had an ice making plant. And Josh Morrisey, would go for an hour or two a day in sort of a lonely kind of solo skate to stay in shape because he said, I wanted to do what I could, everything I could to keep my dad safe. And, he was working out in his gym at home. He will not use it as an excuse. To be clear, he absolutely is not saying anything about his play last year linked to this. But I think as human beings, how could this not have affected what he was going through? Think of your own job, whatever it is. If you had this going on at home in these sort of circumstances, how could it not impact, let alone compete in an athletic, event at the highest possible level? So a tragic story for sure. They had a beautiful memorial service just over a week ago, which Josh said was, real nice to hear the way his dad impacted so many. But a heavy heart for Josh Morrisey and his family for sure.
Well, no doubt about it. And it was a really nice piece. I suggest people pick it up, and we're getting some comments from it already from what the people that had read it. And, and Morrissey's always been such an easy guy to cheer for. And I think that, he has, on account, never mind what he has done on the ice, just the man that he is and the individual that we've gotten to know over the years, that, people, really are pulling for him. And I think that when, we sort of learned through your reporting and some of the other things that came out what had been going through, I mean, it's logical to think that because, I mean, listen, you can be in the best shape in the world. If your head's not right. In anything, it's tough to, be close to your best. And like you said, no one's using any excuse, or, he certainly isn't having any excuses for him. But, and hey, coming back to playing the game after all of this might not be easy right off the bat. But, moving on in a positive way on a team that, he is a huge part of, with a very different looking blue line this year. I certainly think that there are better things for Josh Morrisey going forward. Let's talk about Ehlers for a minute. He, of course, scored a couple of goals for the Danes today as they look to qualify for the Olympics. We have not talked a lot about his role on this team going into next season, but I did want to bring this up to you. We know how effective he was. We've talked about all the underlying numbers. I mean, you didn't need underlying numbers if you were watching the team last year just to know the star that he has turned into and how effective he's been. And yet he still was, not on that top line. He wasn't on that top power play. How do you think things work through training camp? And is Ehlers a guy that, might start the season in a different position than he was before, Mike? Or do you think we'll sort of pick up where we left off with that top six coming back intact? And, maybe over the course of the year, Ehlers will get spelled in and maybe play a little bit more. How do you see that playing out, before we even get to the regular season?
Yeah, I think Nikolaj Ehlers has to be on the top line right out of camp, game one. He's got to be, and presumably it would be on the right side on that top line. When I say game one, we know that Mark Scheifele will not be the number one center for game one this year, Huss. Don't forget, folks. I hate to put salt in the old wound. Mark Scheifele still has a one-game suspension to serve. So his debut will have to come a few nights later up in San Jose, not in Anaheim. I don't know who the number one center is for game one. Is it Pierre-Luc Dubois? Is it Paul Stastny? Is it Andrew Kopp? I mean, the lineup for the first game will look different, obviously. Likely, well, it will for game two, because Mark Scheifele is for sure coming in the lineup for game two. That being said, I don't care who the center is. Nikolaj Ehlers should be on the wing on that top line. And, Blake Wheeler, to me, can't be on that top line. I mean, maybe in spurts and in small doses, Blake Wheeler for sure is still on your top power play unit, no question about it. But I think, Blake Wheeler's probably better suited at this stage now in a second or even maybe a third line pair role here going forward. I mean, I think the top six, it's pretty set, right? Like Andrew Kopp for sure could come up there, and he probably does in the first game because Scheifele's out. But I think we know that there's going to be some combination of Scheifele, Wheeler, Connor, Ehlers, Dubois, and Stastny. So those are your six guys. How you want to piece them together? I mean, are you going Stastny, Dubois, and Wheeler? Is that your second line? If you're going Scheifele, Connor, Ehlers, and then of course you've got your third line with Lowry and Kopp, I believe. But we also know, like Andrew Kopp has played, and I thought played really well when he was with, I believe it was with Paul Stastny and Nikolaj Ehlers at one point. So there are options for sure. But to me, this is a team. This is in a way Nikolaj Ehlers' team. He is the engine now for your offense, right? He's the guy that does so much. And I think we saw big strides in his defensive game as well this past year. Yes, there's still room for improvement there, no question about it. But he became a very consistent offensive producer. I think he, lost sort of that streaky label that maybe he had at times. And I think, kind of shedding the reputation that he wasn't a playoff performer. He was really good in the bubble in Edmonton. He was really good again in the playoffs this past season. And I think that just gave him some real confidence here. And to me, you've got to, in a lot of ways, build your offense around Nikolaj Ehlers.
Okay, let's say that you're right, and Ehlers is up with Scheifele and Connor on the top line. Can those three guys hack it defensively in matchups against top lines in the league?
Right.
Does Paul Maurice believe that? And I guess the second side of that is it a different story this year because of the additions on the Jet Blue line?
Yes.
Do those additions in Dillon and Schmidt give the opportunity for Paul Maurice to consider that more than he may have done in the past because of what might be happening in their own end? Things will be good in the offensive zone, but what happens on the other side of center?
Oh, they sure as heck do, Huss, because, again, no offense to these guys. They did, I think, at times pretty good jobs last year. But if you'd roll that line out last year, I mean, on the back end, you were probably having one of Tucker Poolman, who for a lot of the year was on your top pairing, or Derek Forbort, who I think as the year went on, the cracks started to show in his game. And as I say, all the respect in the world to those guys. I would say Derek Forbort overachieved last year. The Jets got great value for what they paid Derek Forbort last year. But as the season went on, I think we started to see maybe him regress. So this year, Tucker Pullman and Derek Forbort are not in your top four. They have been replaced with Brendan Dillon and Nate Schmidt. And there's a very good chance that Neil Pionk and Josh Morrissey are the other parts of that top four. And Dylan DeMello certainly would make a case to be in there as well. And if Dylan DeMello is on your third pair with a Logan Stanley, I mean, that's a pretty good pair as well. Or whatever you wanted to do there, whether it was a Ville Heinola, the Jets will have some options. But I think, for sure, when you talk about, say, a Scheifele, Connor, Ehlers line, the argument against that line has always been what you just said, is can they, we know what they can do offensively, can they handle the defensive end? And I think we saw at times last year in all of their games, probably especially in Scheifele's game, he left you wanting a lot more, right, on the defensive side of things. So, that would always be a concern for sure. But I think with what they're going to have on the back end this year, it gives you a little more confidence to maybe deploy those guys and kind of let them do what they do best and have the comfort knowing that you've got a little more reliability back there kind of in behind them to cover for whatever mistakes might inevitably happen.
Let's talk about the power play for a minute. Have you thought at all about how that first unit might look this year? We talk a lot about Blake Wheeler, but I mean, you want to talk about being productive on the power play. He certainly has been over the course of the last few years. But it's been strange in that, there wasn't really a spot for Ehlers even when Patrick Laine was traded. And, having a real quality second unit, which, often featured Neil Pionk too, which for my money was the Jets' best power play defenseman last year. Despite the fact that he didn't have the shot of buff and it looked a lot different when he first started doing it. There are some options, but I am quite wondering, I mean, as far as the forwards go, how do you get Ehlers on that group? Or do you need to do that? Do you try to put together two pretty evenly balanced power play units and, play them both?
Yeah, normally I would say you have to get Ehlers on that top unit just because in the past, Huss, the disparity between what PP1 and PP2 gets on the ice, it was massive. We'd see the first power play unit stay out there for $1.30, $1.40. And, by the time Ehlers would hop over the boards, like the power play was nearly done, right?
The goalie's spanking his stick.
Right. Maybe had time for one reset. And Nikolaj Ehlers would usually do what he does, which is the zone entry machine, right? He'd razzle and dazzle and gain the zone only to have the other guy come out of the box and, too bad, so sad, maybe better luck next time. I'll say this, though, and give Paul Maurice some credit for this. As the season went on last year, and as the second unit featuring Nikolaj Ehlers, and don't forget, it also had guys like Andrew Kopp and Matthew Perreault, who were really good contributors. Kopp is back. Perreault will not be. But they started to see more and more time. And in fact, we saw us. There were times even coming out of like a TV timeout where everybody was rested. Paul Maurice would start that group and he'd leave the Scheifele group on the bench, which that couldn't have been an easy decision, but it was the right decision because he was going with the hot hand. So it all depends on deployment. If Paul Maurice is going to reward the group that is going best, and if the Jets can almost get this internal competition going, which the guys talked about it last year, right? We'd talk to them after games, and there was this friendly rivalry between the two groups, and they were kind of keeping score as to which group was producing more. Like, that's a good thing in my eyes. So you can leave Nikolaj Ehlers for sure if you want to call that the second power play unit, if you're going to give him the equal chance to become the first power play unit and to play, the dominant role, if you will. To me, Huss, the more interesting storyline about the power play is how do you find enough ice for Josh Morrissey and Neil Pionk and now Nate Schmidt, who, for my money, Nate Schmidt's going to be on one of those two power play units, is he not? Like, that's kind of that's an area that he plays a lot of in at least on his past teams. are the Jets going to go with two defensemen on one of those units just to get enough ice time, or does one of those three guys get knocked out of what is a familiar role for them? And I'm curious to see how that maybe works.
Well, I am too. And, sometimes we've joked that it's sort of a union shop in Winnipeg under Mo. And, sometimes guys will just stay in that position because they've been there before. And listen, I'll go back to the start of our conversation. I mean, I've got a lot of optimism that Josh Morrissey steps up and, is more of a clear head, playing with better players, will be in a better situation. But to be honest, at times last year, I kind of thought he was miscast as a guy that was running a number one power play.
Yeah.
I think Neil Pionk absolutely has shown that he's capable of doing that. And I think Nate Schmidt brings a lot of that to the club as well in a position like that. And listen, I know everyone wants their apples. He's on a long-term contract. He doesn't have to worry about putting up a ton of points. He's got to worry about winning games. I don't think it's a bad idea at all if Josh Morrissey spends less time on the power play, makes way for some other guys that might be able to be a bit more efficient, and, saves his time for some hard minutes playing in a top four role in some pretty difficult matchups against the top teams that are coming against the Jets.
Yeah, I could still see where, maybe, and I think, Huss, that Josh Morrissey and Nate Schmidt is probably the number one defensive pairing. That's probably how it looks out of camp. And we probably get Brendan Dillon and Neil Pionk on the second group. And so I do wonder, and I'm with you, Neil Pionk has to stay on the power play. If you look at the last 2 years, forget about the Jets, he's one of the best point producing defensemen in the NHL on the power play. So to me, Neil Pionk is on probably your, whatever you want to call your top power play unit. But I do wonder if we see Morrissey and Schmidt maybe on the back end of quote PP2. And essentially one of those guys, I guess it would be Nate Schmidt, is taking the spot that Matthew Perreault has now vacated, right? And so, you're going basically of your 10 players that are getting power play time, you're using your top 7 forward, the top 6 that we talked about, and Andrew Cott being the 7th. And then you're using those 3 defensemen. And so you're going the 4-1 alignment, on the top power play unit. Is that Scheifele, Wheeler, Stastny, and Connor? Is that what they do, which they usually did, last year? And then are you having like Ehlers, Dubois, and Kopp? Is that your second unit with Morrissey and Schmidt? That's just one scenario that I could see. But yeah, Paul Maurice is going to have some options here. And that's what training camp is obviously going to be about. There's not going to be, in my eyes, a whole lot of jobs that are being fought for here, at least, to make the team. Certainly, the fourth line, there's going to be some competition to see how that shakes out. And I guess there's a competition maybe for the 7th defense position, I guess. I mean, Logan Stanley's on the team, right? Like, so who's the 7th defense? And I think a lot of it's going to depend on what they do with the salary cap. I don't think the Jets are starting the year with 23 players. I think they're carrying a 22-man roster at most, which is just going to mean one extra forward, one extra defenseman. The waivers are going to come into play. Do they waive Sami Niku? Did they try and bury Nate Bolio's contract in the minors? Like, there's some things at play here. And I also think if Billy Heinola is not in your top 6, I don't think you just want him sitting as your 7th. You'd prefer that he's playing on the top line with the Moose. So, there's some things in play here, but that's going to be one of the areas to watch for sure in camp is what happens with the power play.
No doubt about it. Now, Mike, I've been paying attention to a few of the comments in the chat, and this is something that we've heard before. And you even said suggesting Blake Wheeler might be a third liner. Are we making a little too much about some of the struggles Wheeler's had at times last year when he was obviously injured? I mean, You go back, a lot of people are talking about the guy as if he's done. He had 46 points in 50 games. Yeah. He was still a very important player. And as Mitch said, you can talk a lot about the defensive issues on that top line. But Mitch said it best. Scheifele and Connor at times were very suspect defensively, and Wheeler was kind of guilty by association. I don't know. I really think that until we see a significant drop-off, maybe we should just pump the brakes on the demise of Blake Wheeler to the point that maybe some people are suggesting.
Look, he's your captain. He's your leader. He's your highest paid player. Blake Wheeler's not fading into the background here anytime soon. And, as long as there's game there, he's going to be given every opportunity for sure. I don't think at this point Blake Wheeler's a third liner. I think maybe in a year or two we're having that conversation. And again, if Blake Wheeler gets pushed down, to me that means that somebody else has pushed up, and that should be the goal of the Jets, right? You should want somebody to try and knock, the 36-year-old down a spot in your lineup, because it means that somebody else has come and kind of won that job and the team is better for it. We all know at this point in his career, Huss, Blake Wheeler is all about winning a championship. He's not playing for another contract. The personal stats mean diddly squat to Blake Wheeler at this point in the game. And I would suggest, Blake Wheeler would gladly take on a slightly lesser role on this team if it meant that the team was ultimately, enjoying more success as a whole. So, yeah, I mean, the injury for sure. And, we talked about Josh Morrisey, what he was going through last season, Huss, and how so many people were kind of quick to pounce all over him without knowing the whole story. I would say a lot of those same people were doing the same thing to Blake Wheeler, especially early in the year, when we later learned, this was a guy playing through cracked ribs, which would have been extremely painful. And it's part of the reason he looked like he had slowed down significantly. Well, of course he did. You try skating with cracked ribs and playing the kind of game that Blake Wheeler did. So, should he have shut himself down? And maybe it would have been better for everybody if he had taken a couple weeks off to heal rather than trying and play through it. But we know how Blake Wheeler is wired. And, he's a very proud individual for sure. But he's also a guy that I think puts team before anything else. And so I expect we're going to see, I won't even call it a Blake Wheeler comeback, because I think Blake Wheeler is what we know he is. And when he's healthy, he can still be a very effective sort of mid, second line kind of right winger who can do a lot of things and can certainly help on the top power play unit.
Well, and I guess just going kind of contradicting myself a little bit. Well, I mean, maybe it's just all part of the same conversation, but if Wheeler was in a more secondary role than a guy that is out there for the majority of the power play and playing 20 plus at 5-on-5 with those guys, and, maybe you're talking about ice time that goes down 3 or 4 minutes a game, father time is a real thing. And I would suggest that there certainly is an argument that Wheeler, albeit maybe playing with different players, might not have the same point output, but could be as, if not more effective with maybe a little bit of a lesser workload on a nightly basis from the coach.
Well, and let's not forget, Huss, that we're going back to a regular NHL schedule this year. 82 games, not 56, right? A lot more travel. The Jets are going to be in the air and in hotels a lot more than they were this past season when they played exclusively in Canada. And they'd often stay in the same city for, 4 or 5 days, right? So, that's a tough schedule. It's a grind on anybody. And the older you get, the tougher it gets for sure. So I think that's going to be a key, is to monitor that. The Jets don't have a lot of older players. They got Paul Stastny and obviously Blake Wheeler, but they still are a relatively youthful group. And you hope you got the fresh legs and all that to carry your team. But yeah, watching that ice time for sure. And sometimes less really is more, as the saying goes, especially when it comes to an older veteran player.
Mike McIntyre, the Winnipeg Free Press, is with us chatting Jets offseason, looking ahead to training camp. And this speaks to the great position that Jet fans are in right now, the summer that Kevin Cheveldayoff had, the excitement about the club. I would say the most hot button topic in our chat has been, can Eric Comrie be the backup goalie for the Winnipeg Jets? And if we're talking about the backup goalie as the most glaring issue, I would say that's a first world problem for it being NHL fans. But let's talk about that for a minute. What do you think is at stake for Eric Comrie going into training camp, going into the preseason? And let's assume that he's the guy when we drop the puck in Anaheim for game number 1 of 82. How long of a leash will Eric Comrie have? What does he need to do with his first opportunities? And how realistic is the possibility of maybe adding another goaltender at some point? How do you see that all happening, Mike?
Right. So let me say this. I know some people will look at Eric Comrie's NHL numbers and just immediately write him off. Say this guy is an absolute bust at the NHL level. He cannot be an NHL goalie. He's a career minor leaguer. I've heard that a ton. You have to look at Eric Comrie's handful of NHL starts spread over a number of seasons and the circumstances of those games. Like, I mean, and this applies usually to backups across the board. They are not getting the primo starts, right? They're the guy that's coming in on the back half of the second half of a back-to-back when the team in front of them has dead legs. And they're the guy, it's a tough job for sure. Eric Comrie's numbers and what he's done at the AHL level, you can't dispute that he has been a terrific AHL goaltender. He owns all kinds of Manitoba Moose records. He just passed Corey Schneider, who turned out to be a pretty good NHL goaltender himself, right? And Eric Comrie is still a young goaltender. We see goalies all the time, well into their 20s. Some guys, they're 30 or older before they really start to come into their own. So I'm not ready to write Eric Comrie off at all. That being said, for sure, I mean, you look at the cap situation the Jets had, and it became abundantly clear, especially when they got Dillon and Schmidt, this team didn't have a lot of money to play with. And I should add, when they re-signed Paul Stastny, right? Dillon, Schmidt, Stastny, those three guys kind of ate up most of the cash the Jets had. All they really could do at that point is kind of entry level or, minor league or minimum salary sort of kind of deals, which, you've seen guys like Riley Nash, come in on and some of these other players that are going to be kind of competing for depth spots. So, yes, you could make the argument that the Jets had to go cheap, if you will, on the backup goalie position. Ideally, Connor Hellebuck's going to play 65 games next season. We know that Connor Hellebuck would play 82 games if they'd let him. The Jets will not let him play all 82, but, he's going to want to play as much as he can. So you're talking about, 15, 17 starts for Eric Comrie, spread out over 6 months. He's going to play like 3 times a month, which is not, again, it's not an easy position to come into. But I will say this. I think the lineup that Eric Comrie will be coming into will be the best lineup that he's ever, had in front of him. And especially the blue line, his few starts in the past with the Jets, he will not have had this kind of blue line in front of him. When he played his one game with New Jersey last year, he didn't have a team like this in front of him. When he played his couple games with the Red Wings the year before, didn't have a team like this in front of him. So, I think let's give the guy a chance. Let's give him a clean slate. He's not going to they're not asking him to come in and be all world and, steal them all kinds of games. He just has to be okay. That being said, if he comes in and after a few starts looks overmatched, Kevin Cheveldayoff will have to do something, no question about it. He won't have a lot of money to do something with. We know there are some veteran guys out there, got journeyman goaltenders right now that don't have homes. Like, I suppose as time goes on, their price goes down, right? So is there a possibility that the Jets could look at bringing a guy in who's got some NHL experience and maybe some success at that level, a more veteran guy? Sure, that could happen. But ideally, Eric Comrie is going to take this opportunity, which I would suggest is an opportunity he's never had before. And given what he's done at the AHL level, he's absolutely earned the chance to at least be the first guy up to get this crack. And if he can kind of take the ball and run with it at the salary he's making, the Jets will be all the better for him.
Well, no doubt. And I'm glad you brought that up. When we were having this conversation, I don't know, a few weeks ago, I did point out Eric Comrie's played 5 games for the Jets. I mean, I don't know how much you want to put into his one game with New Jersey or his 3 games with the Detroit Red Wings, as they were the worst teams in the National Hockey League when he was playing for them. And you look at the 5 games he played for the Winnipeg Jets. First game he ever played, one game that the first season, he won in Columbus and stopped a ton of rubber early on in a hockey game that the Jets didn't really show up for. The next year he played 3 games, one of which I believe was also against Columbus. And then the final game he played as a Jet was game 81 of the 2019 season, when the Jets were falling apart at the seams, combusting internally. That's the game we all remember of Byfuglien smashing the stick after the power play and the infamous closed door meeting 1 game away from the playoffs. So I will say to people that want to just put the stamp on Eric Comrie based on what they've seen from Winnipeg, I'm not sure that many goaltenders would have fared any better in the situation that he was put in. All that being said, you do have to get the job done and you do have to prove yourself. And that's why I do think that his training camp and his preseason is going to be so much more important than maybe for any other player that we look to be on that opening day roster. Because here's the thing, Mike. If their spidey senses are tingling, shall we say, about that position when you get to the end of the preseason, that's the unique opportunity where, I mean, you could send Eric Comrie down if you have another guy, and that's when the third goalies and all of these other teams are going to be there for free on the waiver wire, probably at a very similar salary to what Eric Comrie has. There'll be an Anton Forsberg this year. Right. Hell, Eric Comrie was that guy for the last couple of years that got put on waivers and went somewhere else and then ended up getting a spot. I'm not sure whether those same opportunities are there for Kevin Cheveldayoff and Larry Simmons and Zinger 3-4 weeks into the season. So I really do think that it will be incumbent on Comrie to show up, have a great camp, play well in the preseason, because if they do feel that they have to pull a trigger or explore that, their options are going to be significantly different, I think, a month into the season than they will be when everyone hits the waiver wire.
No, you're right. And we saw the goalie musical chair game happen early in this last season, right? And a bunch of guys, and Anton Forsberg, obviously. And I know the taxi squad, created an interesting dynamic because you had to have that third guy kind of still up with the big club, and then you had to still stock your AHL roster. So the taxi squad is gone, but I think we're still going to see some of those same interesting dynamics. And you're right. I know a lot of people ask about a guy like Mikkel Burden, the Birdman. Why isn't he an option? Does he have a shot here? I would say it's still too early for Mikkel Burden to be a backup goalie at the NHL level. Like, there's some things for sure about Mikkel Burden that are very intriguing. Could he develop into a backup goalie at the NHL? Absolutely. Could he develop into a starter at the NHL level one day? I don't see why not. But I think he's a guy, he needs more games, right? And he needs the games to be at a lower leverage, a lower stake kind of. And so the Jets, they would love Mikkel Burden to go down and just play a ton with the Moose this year, be the number one guy down there, and continue to work at his craft and get that odometer up, right? So that one day he could perhaps step into that role with the big club. But I think the time is not now. I mean, sure, if the Jets were to get hit by an injury situation or something freakish, they may have no choice, at least for a spell. But I don't think that's not the in case of emergency break glass situation that you want to have to rely on right now. And I do think the Jets would look outside the organization before they look to a guy like Mikkel Burden if Eric Comrie, they don't feel, can get the job done.
I'm with you 100% on that. I think the plan is for Burden to get back to the Manitoba Moose and play a ton of hockey this year and potentially be ready for that role, possibly the following season, or, depending on what happens with Comrie, have a real legitimate competition between those two and have a legit third guy that, they feel confident about coming out if they need. Man, Mike, this was great. It's been a long time since we've had a legit all hockey conversation. I will direct people to your piece in the Winnipeg Free Press if they want to talk about COVID and some of the things that we're dealing with right now. We got a little too far down that rabbit hole with Rod Paterson
Yes.
earlier today. So another reason to go read Mike's fine work in the Winnipeg Free Press. Thanks so much for doing this. What's going on now? You finished the golf tour? Are we going to get back writing in the newspaper in the next little bit? What do you got cooking?
Well, I almost feel guilty for saying this, Huss, but after tomorrow, I actually start a week of holidays. Now, some would say, wait a minute, you went golfing a couple of days during work this week. Wasn't that like holidays? And to which I really have no defense. So I'm actually off next week, but I am writing one more piece tomorrow before signing off for the weekend. It's actually kind of what we've touched on a bit. It's going to be more about Josh Morrisey and the bigger issue of just how kind of broadening away from just sports, how everybody's fighting a battle these days, and maybe we shouldn't be so quick to just judge people, whether it's an athlete or a fellow human being, because we don't know what people are often going through. And I think we've seen that, whether it's Josh Morrisey and what he played through last year. I even look back to some of the vitriol directed Blake Wheeler's way when he was obviously fighting through an injury. And I just, it rubs me the wrong way how vicious and cruel I think people can be at times. And I think the Morrisey story is just a good reminder of how a little kindness sometimes can go a long way. So I'm going to have a piece that'll run in Saturday's paper, just kind of picking up on Josh Morrisey's story and building off that. And then, on holidays for a week. And I do plan on hitting the golf course a time or two as well. Also heading out to the dump next week, which that in and itself, that's like a field trip, right?
Just going to go hit some balls out there, get ready for the round, or
maybe throw my club, maybe leave my clubs behind.
Yeah, probably searching for a new putter in the dump at some point. Hey, Mike, this was a lot of fun. We always love having you on the program. Thanks so much for doing this, and you be well. Enjoy that week off, because we know when we get on the other side of Labor Day weekend, the sports world gets cranked up again. The NFL starting, the big games in the Canadian Football League, and training camp right around the corner. And just on the way out, let me ask you this, because you talk about a lot of the vitriol you hear, and God knows I wouldn't want to be in your inbox after the column that you put out today, considering what I've seen on a regular basis. But how would you characterize, I can tell you from my personal standpoint, 10 years, at the start, first year was different. We were back in the National Hockey League. Everything was incredible, and we were just happy to be there. I can't remember, even including the 2018 season with that incredible run.
Yeah.
I can't remember legitimate excitement amongst Jet fans about this coming year. And, sure, a lot of it's going to be, hey, we can hopefully get back and actually watch games again. But the moves Kevin Cheveldayoff made over the course of this offseason, even his greatest critics are seeming to be pretty excited about the upcoming year. Are you feeling that same thing from Jet fans when you're opening up your inbox when you haven't touched on some of the more controversial topics of today?
Yeah, when I'm not being called a sheep or sheeple, part of the sheeple movement. Absolutely, Huss. And, the roster additions aside, like, it seems like the Jets kind of hit all the right notes off the ice as well. Everything from the heritage announcements, the Howard Chuck statue at True North Square, bringing back making the heritage jerseys the full time, which, by the way, Josh Morrisey told me that's one of the things he's most excited about. He said he said the first time he ever laid eyes on those jerseys, his word to me was they were stunning. And he loves the fact that they're going to wear them 14 times at home this season. And even the moves that, True North and the Jets kind of led the way. We've seen other sports organizations now follow, but with the vaccination requirement, to attend games. And I think certainly there's a vocal minority that doesn't sit well with, but I would suggest the silent majority love that move as well, as they should. So the excitement is absolutely building, and the Jets, in my eyes, and I think in a lot of people's eyes, this is going to be the deepest, most talented team that they're going to roll out, at least since that 2018 magical run to the Western Conference Final. And it's going to be a lot of fun to kind of follow them over the 6 or 7 or dare everyone dream 8 months that this season is going to last.
Well, I can tell you, I'm looking forward to it. I know everyone in the chat is as well, and I'm also looking forward to more conversations like this with you. Just great feedback from everyone with your return to the program, Mike. Even in the dog days of summer, we can have a great Jets conversation here on Winnipeg Sports Talk with you. Thanks so much for doing that. Keep it in the fairway, hit them straight, and maybe the next time you pull out the Sherwood on the green, it drops again.
For sure. Thanks, Huss. Take care.
Great stuff. There he is, Mike McIntyre of the Winnipeg Free Press. You can follow him on Twitter at Mike McIntyre WPG and check out all of Mike's work daily in the Winnipeg Free Press. That was just a great conversation. We haven't had a lot of Jets news to talk about, but some of our regulars that we're often talking with throughout the hockey season have all been on holidays, and of course, we're talking Bombers and CFL and NFL training camps, but that certainly is the bread and butter of Winnipeg Sports Talk. That was a great conversation with Mike. I hoist a Little Brown Jug 1919 in Mike's honor, not to mention the fact that dude has dropped over 100 pounds. Man, he looks great. A lot of nice comments for Mike as well in the chat.